December 1975, in a lab in Rochester, New York. A young Kodak engineer named Steve Sasson points a device the size of a toaster at a colleague, and 23 seconds later, her photograph appears on a television screen. It is the first digital picture ever taken. His bosses tell him no one will ever want to look at pictures on a television. Sasson has just invented the future of photography. His company will spend the next 30 years refusing to sell it. This is Kilobyte Chronicles. To understand why Kodak would do such a thing, you first have to understand what Kodak actually sold, and it was not cameras. The story starts almost a century earlier, with a young man from Rochester named George Eastman. Eastman had left school at 14 to support his widowed mother, worked as an office boy, then taught himself chemistry at night at his kitchen table. What he was chasing was a way to free photography from its cage. In the 1880s, taking a picture meant hauling glass plates, tripods, tints, and toxic chemicals. It was a craft for professionals and obsessives. Eastman wanted to make it so simple that anyone could do it, and in 1888 he did. He introduced a small wooden box camera, preloaded with a roll of flexible film long enough for 100 exposures, and he gave it a made-up word for a name, a word he chose because it was short, sharp, and impossible to misspell. He called it the Kodak. And here's the idea that built the empire, and the same idea that would one day destroy it. The Kodak camera cost $25, about $400 in today's money, and when you finished your roll, you did not develop it yourself. You mailed the entire camera back to Rochester. Kodak took out your film, developed it, made your prints, reloaded the camera with a fresh roll, and mailed the whole thing back to you. Eastman put that entire philosophy into one of the most famous advertising slogans ever written. You press the button, we do the rest. In 1900, he pushed it further with the Brownie, a box camera so simple a child could use it, and it sold for $1. Eastman was practically giving the cameras away because the camera was never where the money was. Think of it as a razor and its blades. You sell the razor cheap and you make your fortune forever on the blades. Kodak's blades were film and photographic paper and processing chemicals and the developing itself. Every single photograph taken on a Kodak camera for the entire life of that customer sent a little more money flowing back to Rochester. It was one of the most profitable business models ever invented by anyone in any industry. And it worked so well that by 1927, Kodak had a near total monopoly on photography in the United States. Hold on to that razor and blades idea because it is the key to absolutely everything that follows. It made Kodak one of the richest and most admired companies in America, and it was a trap that would take almost 100 years to spring. For most of the 20th century, Kodak did not compete in photography. Kodak simply was photography. At its peak, the company controlled around 90% of all the film sold in the United States, and about 85% of the cameras. Its small yellow film boxes sat on store shelves in every town on earth. It gave the English language a phrase, the Kodak moment, meaning any instant so precious that you had to stop and capture it. Kodachrome, its most beloved color film, was so woven into American life that a musician wrote a hit song named after it. Hollywood ran on Kodak movie stock. When human beings first walked on the moon, much of what they shot on Kodak film. The company employed 145,000 people, and it poured money into one of the great industrial research laboratories in the world. If a moment mattered to someone in the 20th century, there is a very good chance it still lives right now on a piece of Kodak film in a shoebox in a closet. And every one of those moments had paid Kodak twice, once for the film and once again to develop it. The machine hummed along, cheap cameras in, endless blades out, decade after decade after decade, which is exactly why in 1975, inside that same company, almost nobody wanted to hear what a 24-year-old engineer had just built. Steve Sasson had joined Kodak in 1973, an electrical engineer in a company that mostly hired chemists because cameras and film were chemistry, not circuits. His supervisor handed him a loose, open-ended assignment to find some possible use for a new light-sensing chip called a charge-coupled device, made by a company called Fairchild Semiconductor. Given the freedom to tinker, Sasson built something nobody had asked him to build. He salvaged a lens from a Kodak movie camera, wired it to that Fairchild sensor, an analog-to-digital converter, a stack of 16 batteries, and a portable cassette recorder to hold the image. In December of 1975, a lab technician named Joy Marshall agreed to sit for the first picture. It took 23 seconds to record onto the tape, and it played back as a ghostly, low-resolution, black-and-white image on a television set. It was crude. It was also unmistakably a working camera that used no film whatsoever. Sasson demonstrated it to Kodak's executives, and here honest history matters because the popular version of this story is not quite right. The executives did not panic or scream or lock the machine away in a vault. Their reaction was quieter, and in its way far more revealing. They were curious, they were skeptical, and above all they asked the practical questions. Who would want this? Why would anyone squint at their photographs on a television set instead of holding a real print in their hands? And underneath all of it, the one question that truly mattered. What would this do to film? Kodak was not blind. In fact, the company patented the digital camera technology in 1978 and collected real money from that patent for years. This was not a failure to see. It was something much harder to fix. Kodak looked directly at the future, understood it completely, and decided that it simply could not afford to sell it. Because a digital camera had no film, no paper, no processing, no chemicals. Digital had no blades. And this was not a single mistake made in a single meeting, which is what turns this from an accident into a tragedy. Sasson kept working. By 1989, he and a colleague had built something far beyond that first toaster, a digital camera that looked and functioned much like the ones we would all eventually carry, storing compressed images onto a memory card. It was genuinely commercially ready. And Kodak's own marketing department told him in so many words that yes, they could sell it, but no, they would not, because it would cut into film sales. Sit with that for a moment. The company that invented the digital camera chose, deliberately and repeatedly, not to sell the finished product, in order to protect the exact business that digital was going to destroy anyway. The most profitable machine in the history of photography had become a cage that its owner could not bring itself to walk out of. But the future was never going to ask Kodak for permission. What makes the next 20 years so painful is that Kodak knew. This was not a sleeping company. It had, if anything, been thrashing for a way out for years. Back in 1988, convinced that its real future might lie in chemistry rather than photography, Kodak had spent over $5 billion to buy a pharmaceutical company called Sterling Drug, an expensive detour it would later unwind at a loss. Over and over, a new leader would arrive, announce that Kodak was finally going digital, and then run straight into the same wall. In 1993, the board fired its sitting chief executive and brought in an outsider, George Fisher from Motorola, a serious technologist who had trained at Bell Labs. Fisher understood the threat perfectly, and he was blunt about it. Inside Kodak, he said, digital photography was treated as the enemy, a force that would wipe out the film and paper business the entire company was built on. He poured billions into digital research. And yet Kodak's single biggest product bet of those very years reveals the trap perfectly. Instead of committing fully to digital, Kodak led an entire industry push to launch a brand new kind of film, a format called Adventix in 1996. It was a beautifully engineered answer to a question the world had already stopped asking. Consumers shrugged, and it flopped. Kodak had looked straight at the digital wave and responded by building a better version of the past. He struck a deal so quietly ironic it is almost hard to believe. When Apple launched its early quick-take consumer digital cameras in the mid-1990s, they carried the Apple name, but they were built by Kodak. And yet, for all of it, Kodak's revenue still peaked at around $16 billion in 1996 on the strength of film, and the digital transformation kept not quite happening. Fisher was gone by 2000. His successors inherited the identical trap. Daniel Karp pushed a line of consumer digital cameras called EasyShare and acquired an online photo sharing service called Ofoto. And on the surface, it looked like it might finally be working. In 2005, Kodak became the #1 seller of digital cameras in the United States, with about 21% of the market, and its digital revenue that year jumped 40% to nearly $6 billion. Kodak had, at last, caught digital. And it was quietly bleeding to death anyway, because here is the arithmetic that no amount of market share could fix. To win those digital camera sales against Canon and Sony and Nikon, Kodak often priced its cameras below what they cost to make, losing, by one estimate, around $60 on every single camera it sold. It was buying market share it could never make money on in a business that, unlike film, would never pay it a second time. Say it again, digital had no blades. The last man to try was Antonio Perez, who took over in 2005 from Hewlett-Packard, where he had helped build HP's enormous inkjet printer business. Perez made the most aggressive BET of all. He shut film factories, outsourced manufacturing, and eliminated around 27,000 jobs, gutting the company to pivot it toward digital printing and inkjet, trying to build a new razor and blades machine to replace the old one. By 2009, 70% of Kodak's revenue came from digital products. On paper, the transformation had happened, and it still was not enough because the margins were thin, the competition was brutal, and every one of those decisions ran up against a fact that Kodak could never escape. Kodak was the largest employer in Rochester. Its film plants employed tens of thousands of people in a company town that depended on it completely. To go fully digital was to gut the very community that was Kodak. That obligation, that history, that pride became an anchor the company could not cut loose. Then worldwide film sales, which had peaked in 2001, did not just decline. They cratered as ordinary people realized they could take 100 pictures, look at them instantly, delete the bad ones, and never buy a roll of anything ever again. And then the razor itself vanished. Cell phones learned to take photographs, good ones, then great ones, always in your pocket, free to shoot and instant to share. And the market for cheap, standalone digital cameras, the very one Kodak had finally clawed its way to the top of, simply evaporated in the space of a few short years. In the year before the end, Kodak's shrinking film business still earned about $34 million, while its digital camera division lost $349 million, 10 times as much. And there is one single moment that holds the entire tragedy inside it. In April of 2012, as part of its collapse, Kodak sold that photo sharing website, Ofoto, for less than $25 million. That very same month, Facebook bought a photo sharing app called Instagram for $1 billion. Kodak had owned a way for people to share their pictures online, and it sold it for pennies at the precise instant that the world decided sharing pictures online was the most valuable thing in all of photography. And none of it was fate. Kodak's great rival, Fujifilm, faced the exact same digital wave and survived by ruthlessly reinventing itself, turning its film chemistry into cosmetics and medicine, and it remains a healthy company to this day. Fujifilm had the same kind of chemists, the same warning signs, the same century of history to protect. It simply chose to let the past go. The wave was identical. The choice was not. On January 19, 2012, after more than 120 years, the Eastman Kodak company filed for bankruptcy in New York. On paper, it listed about $5.1 billion in assets against nearly $6.8 billion in debt, dragged down further by enormous pension obligations to generations of Rochester workers, and it needed a $950 million loan from Citigroup just to keep operating while it reorganized. And in the cruelest detail of the entire story, to survive, Kodak sold off its crown jewels, around 1,100 patents, including the foundational digital imaging patents that Kodak itself had invented and then refused to build a future on. Analysts had once valued that portfolio as high as $2.5 billion. Kodak got roughly $525 million for it, sold to a consortium that included Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Samsung. The very companies building the future Kodak had walked away from now bought the pieces of it that Kodak had invented first. A smaller Kodak emerged from bankruptcy in 2013 and still exists today, printing for businesses, making chemicals, at one point even trying to launch its own cryptocurrency, and repurposing some of its old film coating machines to help make batteries for electric cars. It survives. But the giant, the Kodak that owned the American memory, was gone for good. So go back one final time to that lab in Rochester in 1975, to the young engineer holding a toaster full of wire and the executives who told him no one would ever want to look at pictures on a television. It is so tempting to call them fools. But they were not fools. They saw exactly what Steve Sasson had built. They understood precisely what it meant. That was the whole problem. Kodak's fatal flaw was never that it failed to see the future coming. It was that it saw the future with perfect clarity and could not bring itself to be the one to end its own golden age. For 100 years, Kodak had taught the world a single gentle promise. You press the button, we do the rest. And in the end, the world picked up a different kind of camera and pressed a different kind of button, and Kodak was the one left standing there with nothing left to do. Digital had no blades. And neither in the end did Kodak. The little yellow boxes are mostly gone from the shelves now, and a Kodak moment is just a phrase people say. But somewhere in your house, or your parents' house, there is almost certainly a shoebox full of photographs, the birthdays and the vacations and the weddings and the faces of people you love, all of it captured on Kodak film, in the long century when Kodak owned the moment. The company lost almost everything, but it is still there. In those boxes, in the faces and the birthdays and the ordinary afternoons it helped 100 years of families hold on to. So tell me in the comments, did you shoot on Kodak, and what is the one photograph you are most grateful you still have? The people who lived this history know it better than any earnings report ever could. Subscribe and we will chronicle the next one together.